Hello, pantry stalkers. Today we are making roasted tomatillo chickpeas and we're going to be canning them. And this is a recipe from the Complete Guide to Pressure Canning by Diane Devereaux. Okay. And so this is a more complex recipe than I have typically done. And there's several steps to it. There's a lot of ingredients. I think it's going to be really good though, so I think it's worth it. But I decided to do some of it ahead of time, and I took some pictures along the way, and I'm going to just talk through what I did because I thought that would make a little faster, less complex video. So it starts off by saying 3 cups of dried chickpeas. So I took the chickpeas. That was a little bit more than a pound of dried chickpeas. I measured out 3 cups. I rinsed them to clean them off and looked to see if there were any bad chickpeas. There weren't, so I just rinsed them. I then put them in a pot and I covered with 2 inches of water, brought them to a boil, boiled for 5 minutes, and then turned the heat off and put a lid on. And they've been sitting in that hot water for about a half hour or so. Okay, next it calls for 20 tomatillos. I ended up using about 13 tomatillos, and the reason is I did grocery pickup. I requested 2.5 pounds of tomatillos, which is what I got, and I think that's a good amount, but some of the tomatillos were huge, and I'll pop up pictures so you can see how big they were compared to some. So even though I only have 13, I feel like I have the right amount of tomatillos. So anyway, what I did with the tomatillos is I husked them, I washed them real good, I cut the tops off, and when they were, there were big, thick stems, that type of thing, I cut the tops off, cut them in half, put them skinned the cut side down onto a baking sheet and drizzled with some olive oil. I then roasted them in a 400-degree oven for about 25-30 minutes. I actually have them sitting in there now with the oven turned off until I'm ready for them. So tomatillos, husked, washed, cut in half, and roasted. All right. And also the 8 to 10 whole garlic cloves peeled those, and I put them in with the tomatillos before roasting them. All right. And then I'll go ahead and show you the rest of the ingredients because I still have them out. A medium sweet onion diced. It says 1 cup. I have, I think, more than 1 cup because it was a little bit bigger. It calls for 4 garlic cloves minced, a teaspoon of paprika, a teaspoon of ground coriander. Now, I only had whole coriander, so this is a tip for you. I would prefer buying whole spices and then grinding them yourself. So what I did is I heated these in a skillet. Just, I didn't measure. I just dumped quite a bit in there. Heated them in a dry skillet, kind of roasted them until there was just a really nice fragrance. Let them cool and grind them in a coffee grinder. And so I'm going to, have these in my pantry now, but for today I will only need a teaspoon of ground coriander. I will be using a half a teaspoon of cumin and a teaspoon of yellow curry powder. It also calls for a teaspoon, of course, sea salt. I'm using kosher salt. And then finally 4 cups of chicken stock. Now I am using I just heated up a little bit of water and I put in 4 teaspoons of chicken bouillon granules. Okay, so those are the ingredients. And again, I'm going to put those into a blog post, and so don't worry about trying to keep up with those ingredients. In terms of the preparation, you'll see there's my Instant Pot and there's also my Nesco canner. So for the Instant Pot, the only reason I use this, and you do not need an Instant Pot, is I put my jars and lids and the rubber gaskets, I'm using the Harvest Guard lids, into that. I heated it up. I have the lid on so that they'll stay hot. And of course, I had washed the jars ahead of time. With the Nesco canner, I put in 8 cups of water and heated it up. I've left the lid on so it should stay reasonably warm. Okay, so I'll be working with hot product, hot jars and lids, and then hot water in the canner. And this recipe will make 5 pints, at least that's what it says in the recipe, 5 pints. Okay, so I also have this pot, and I have a tablespoon of olive oil in the pot. Okay. One other thing is you'll note, let me see, move that out of the way. I've got a bowl and an immersion blender. That's to blend up the roasted tomatillos. Now the recipe says to put it into a food processor in batches. I've got a really small food processor, so I thought it might be easier to just use an immersion blender to blend all of them up at once. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with doing the actual cooking. Okay, so I've heated the oil in the pan and in the pot, and I've added my onion and my garlic. And I'm going to turn this down a little bit. You can see this pot has seen better days, but that's kind of what happens sometimes when we use our cookware. So anyway, I'm just going to saute this onion and garlic for about 5 minutes until, and keep stirring it until the onion is translucent. So I'll bring you back when it gets to that point. Okay, the onions are now translucent, and so the next step is for me to drain the chickpeas. So you can see I've got the chickpeas, you can see they're still hot. I'm going to drain those, shake off the excess water, and then dump the chickpeas into the pot. Okay, I've been frying up the chickpeas for the 5 minutes, and now I'm going to put the spices in. It calls for a teaspoon of paprika. I've got a teaspoon of paprika, a teaspoon of coriander. Remember, this is my coriander powder that I ground up just this morning. Okay, a teaspoon of coriander, a half a teaspoon of cumin. So I've got a half a teaspoon, roughly, of cumin. A teaspoon of yellow curry powder. Whoops. A teaspoon of coarse sea salt. I'm using kosher salt. And it says, and pepper. And I thought, well, I must have just forgotten to, missed pepper on the ingredient list. But it's not on there, so I'm just going to sprinkle a little bit of black pepper. And not too much, because I can always add more pepper if I want to. Okay. All right, so now I need to sear and stir an additional 2 minutes and then remove it from the heat. So I'm going to go ahead and get it started again and stir all those spices in. Oh, it's starting to smell really good now. And sear it for 5 minutes. Or excuse me, 2 minutes. So I'll bring you back when I've finished that process. Okay, I finished searing the chickpeas with the spices, and now I'm going to take my roasted tomatillos, put them into this bowl, and use an immersion blender to puree them, or at least puree them as well as I can. I have found that with using an immersion blender, things don't always get as smooth, but I'm okay if there's a little chunks. So we'll see how that goes. Okay, so before I start pureeing them, I just want to point out that there is a lot of juice. She didn't say to drain the juice. I think there'd be a lot of flavor in the juice, so I'm going to use that juice. Okay, so I finished pureeing them. There might be a few chunks in there, but it looks very nicely pureed. And so I'm happy with how that turned out using the immersion blender. So use whatever you have. If you have a food processor, if you have an immersion blender or a regular blender, just blend up the tomatillos until they're pureed. Okay, so now it says to put this chickpea mixture, or excuse me, the tomatillo mixture into the chickpeas. And I'm going to bring it to a boil and then simmer it for 2 minutes. I see a big piece of tomatillo that I didn't get blended, so I'm just using my, oh, and there's a piece of garlic. So I don't really think that's going to hurt anything. So I'm going to simmer it for 2 minutes, and then we'll be ready to load our jars. Okay, I missed a step, and so I'm going to do that now, and that is putting in the chicken broth into the chickpea mixture and cooking it for 2 minutes. So I'm going to put in the chicken broth, bring it to a boil, and then simmer it for 2 minutes. So you can see how nice and soupy it is right now, and that's a good thing because the chickpeas are only partially cooked, so they're going to absorb some of that broth in the canning process. I'll bring it back after this has come to a boil and has simmered for 2 minutes. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and fill my jars. I've kept them hot in the Instant Pot during this whole process. So I'm going to fill them up, and then I'll debubble, and I'll check the headspace and so on. So according to the recipe, this should make 5 pints. I'm kind of thinking it might be more than that, but we'll see. If it's more, then I'll run a second canner load if needed. I actually have another canner on the way, another Nesco, and so that way if I end up with more than 5 pints, because 5 pints or 4 quarts is as much as the as this canner can do, the Nesco canner can do at one time. So I'm intentionally not making them completely full yet, because I want to be able to add some liquid to them if needed. I'll go back through and level them out a little bit. Now this recipe was definitely more work than some that I've done, than a lot that I've done. But it reminds me of, I've done a fair amount of Indian cooking in my day. And this kind of reminds me of an Indian dish. And so it's kind of no big surprise that it is more work. Okay, I've got some of those even a little bit more full than I should, but I'm going to go ahead and debubble, and then I will adjust things. Like this one almost certainly has more than it should, and I'll spoon some into jars that have less. This is actually why I didn't fill some of them all the way, because I had a feeling that I was going to need to spoon some out. Sometimes it's difficult to get it just right at first, and that's why you measure. All right, so this is supposed to be a generous 1 1/4 inch headspace, and obviously that is going way into it, so no big surprise there. This one is actually about right. This one can use more, and so on. So I'm just going to spoon some out from the ones that are too full into the ones that are not full enough, and then I'll bring it back. Okay, I have adjusted all of the ingredients to all of the jars to have 1/4 of an inch and 1/4 of headspace. And I'm going to wipe the rims, and then I'll put the lids on and get them into the canner. Oh, I do want to mention, this is what's in the pot here is what I have left. Let's see if I can get a good shot of it. And I'm just going to simmer it on the stove and eat it for lunch today, because there might be enough for one more pint, but I'm not going to worry about that. We may as well just eat it today rather than running another load. Okay, let me get the lids on and we'll get it in the canner. And by the way, I'm putting the extra vinegar into the canner. I went to put the first jar in the canner and it didn't want to sit right, and I noticed I had my canning rack on upside down. So I just adjusted that, and now I'll get the rest of the lids on and get everything into the canner. Okay, you can see that I have all 5 jars in the canner, and there's just something I wanted to show you. If you're using this canner, this valve should go about in the middle of a can like that, a canning jar like that. And then when you close it and turn it, it will be in between these 2 jars, and that will allow the steam, the heat, the pressure, everything to go properly through the vent. Okay, so I've got the canner lid on. I'm going to close it, and I'm going to plug in the canner, switch it to the exhaust position, and then I'm selecting high. I'm putting in the time of 75 minutes because that is the length of time you need to process pints that have any type of protein really in them. So, and then I'm pushing start. Okay, it's going to go around like this for up to 30 minutes. I don't think it'll take quite that long since I'm starting with hot jars, hot water, hot product, but it can take up to 30 minutes. Then once the right amount of heat and pressure is built up, steam will release through the valve, and there will be a countdown for 10 minutes. It'll start at E10 and go down to E0. I don't know if you can hear it, but there is, or see it especially, but there is steam coming out. It still hasn't hit the E10, hasn't come up here. But something that I wanted to clarify that I either misspoke or didn't mention earlier was once it does E10 and then counts down from E10, then I'm going to switch this valve to the airtight position. Right now it's in the exhaust position. And then once I move it to the airtight position, it has to build up the right amount of pressure, and then it will automatically start the countdown process. It will count down for 75 minutes. When it does that, it will shut off automatically, and I'll need to wait a minimum of 1 hour before opening the lid. Okay, and it could take longer than that for the pressure to drop, but it's a minimum of 1 hour. Okay, it has been counting down from E10. It's now at E1. You can probably hear all of the steam that's coming out. And so in less than a minute now, it's going to switch to E0, and I'll switch the valve to airtight. Okay, there it goes to E0. I'm going to take you up here, and I'm going to switch the valve to the airtight position. Okay. It'll take a little while for the pressure to build up all the way. This is similar to if you're using a stovetop canner, you put the weight on. What I did switching that to airtight, it's like I just put the weight on. And so it takes a while to get to where the right amount of pressure builds, but I don't need to do anything here. It will all happen automatically at this point. Once the right amount of pressure builds, then it's going to switch to 75 minutes and it'll start the countdown process. Hello everyone, I just wanted to show you how these turned out. As you probably recall, I put 5 pints into the canner. I had one that did not seal. These other ones did seal. So the one that did not seal, I put into the refrigerator right away, and so we'll eat it within the next couple of days. And I did give it a taste. It tastes good. It's very, you can see it's very, very thick. And so what I personally think I'm going to do before I make this next time is actually cook the chickpeas at least halfway through before I add them in. Now remember that they had been boiled for 5 minutes and then let to sit for, oh, I don't know, a half hour or so before adding to the other ingredients and canning. But I do think that they would maybe come out not quite as thick. Now maybe it's supposed to be this thick, I don't know, because the book doesn't actually say. And these are fine. I mean, they do taste good and all of that. You could also always thin them a little bit. But I prefer to see a little bit of liquid in the jar, and I don't with these. So the question is, will I make it again? And the answer is yes. But I think that I will start with barely cooked chickpeas, meaning they're cooked through, but they have some bite to them so that they hold up in the jar. So I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, I'd appreciate it if you would like the video, and also if you haven't already done so, if you would subscribe to my channel. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day.